Welcome back to the second part of our lecture on the provisional government and the rise of the Soviet. In the first part, we focused on understanding the provisional government, who they were, what their aims were. In this part, we want to focus a little bit more on understanding the Soviet. What was the Soviet and what kind of power did it wield? So going back again to that February Revolution, we understand that it's a popular support, and the people in particular who really put the pressure on the Tsarist government in February were in the cities. They were workers, factory workers, rail workers, postal workers, and also soldiers who in many cases had deserted the front line, coming back to the cities and joined the protests, and they were armed. These are the people who caused the February Revolution. These were the protesters. These were the ones who really were advocating for change. And they were ecstatic as the February Revolution succeeded and the Tsar was toppled and a new government came into being. But they wanted a voice. And while the provisional government is going on establishing itself, at the same time we see the establishment of a Soviet. And in particular, we first of all see the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' Deputies establish itself in Petrograd. Now, this body had existed back in 1905, so it's really a re-establishment in another revolutionary environment. Within a few days, it was calling itself the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. And that's who they're representing. So the Petrograd Soviet was made up of more than the number of little committees you can see here, but it's people like the Kronstadt sailors, who were well-respected sailors at Kronstadt, just north of Petrograd, but very revolutionary in their thinking. We see other soldier groups forming and wanting to have an input. We see so that they're gathering together, they are discussing, they're debating ideas, and what they are doing then is electing a representative to go to a larger meeting in Petrograd to represent their ideas, represent what it is they want to see in the change. So the Putilov factory is a large factory, well known during the February Revolution for its revolutionary ideas. Other factories developed their own little committees, postal workers, rail workers, and each of these little committees of people who are passionate about change, they are electing their representatives to go to meet in and form the Petrograd Soviet, where these ideas can be represented and played out at a larger level. So our Petrograd Soviet is effectively a body representing workers and soldiers. Okay, it's a socialist body. Most of the members on the Petrograd Soviet were Mensheviks or socialist revolutionaries, so members of those political parties. Some were Bolsheviks. We'll come back to that later. Just a few Bolsheviks. Kerensky, remember Mr. Kerensky? We've got our different political parties represented. Kerensky, who remember was also a member of the provisional government, is a key member of the Petrograd Soviet, well respected, and he actually has the role of chairing the Petrograd Soviet at various times. So a very key individual in what is going to play out in the months after February 1917. Now we need to understand that the Petrograd Soviet is a powerful body due to a number of things. It represents the workers, including your postal and rail workers. They are very influential in running the city. So their support, getting their support, is absolutely crucial if you want to make sure that they are supporting the government. Because when these people go on strike and these people join them and these people join them, then you have a crippled city, which is what happened in February 1917. The Soviet represents these people, represents their views, and so has influence over them. Because these people feel that they are having input with their representatives into the Soviet, if the Soviet gives them an order, they are likely to follow that order. And this is the crux of the power of the Petrograd Soviet. It actually has influence over the people that really are running the cities during 1917. The Soviet also had its own newspaper. Here's a picture of the Soviet meeting at some stage during 1917. Now have a look at the uniforms. I mean, these are not men in their suits. They are much more working class men and soldiers. You can see many of them with their hats on here. So this is the kind of meeting, gathering of the Petrograd Soviet that you're getting. Mostly men, but not all. There are some women in there. They had their own newspaper called Izvestia, which means news, and it's a mechanism for spreading news. Now, while not everybody in Russia could read, enough could read that they could pass on the messages, share the news. There was quite a lot of, reading and passing on messages to neighbours, to friends, joint reading of papers. This is a time where the Russian people want to absorb the news because they actually feel that they are playing a part in it. And so this desire for more information that is not completely censored by the old Tsarist government, there's this passion from the Russian people at this time to be informed so that they can be involved and make choices, something they haven't had that freedom to do before. The message from the Soviet to basically call for an immediate takeover of all landlord estates, that's something that the peasants were happy for. The peasants wanted land, agrarian reform. That was their key goal. And the Soviets seemed to be supporting that. And therefore, the peasants, we're talking about more than 80% of the population, were also hearing what was happening in the cities. And they are supporting whichever group seems to be supporting its call for agrarian reform. What do they want? They want land. They want to take over the land from the landowners. And therefore we see what's called agrarian anarchy gripping the countryside. Peasants just go and seize lands from the landlords, kick their landlords out, kill them in some circumstances. But they are taking the land and pushing the landlords off the land. Many of these, upper class landlords were having to flee from the countryside. Some came into the cities, although they also worked out quite quickly that the cities weren't an ideal situation for them either. We see a lot of upper class people starting to flee out of Russia at this stage, although they haven't completely lost hope. Many soldiers, and remember, many of our soldiers are peasant stock, when they hear about what's happening back in the homelands, they are actually deserting from the front lines, rushing back home to make sure that they get their piece of land, take a part in this revolution that was taking place back at home. But probably the most important mechanism used by the Soviets in order to achieve some kind of power is what we call the Petrograd Soviet's Order Number 1, the first order that the Soviet makes. And they put this out on the 1st of March, 1917. And this is the same day that the Provisional Government is established. What it does, it makes it clear to the supporters of the Soviet, soldiers, workers, if the Provisional Government makes an order, a rule, that's okay. Only if the Soviet has countersigned the order. So the order is made by the Provisional Government and the Soviet has to countersign it to say that that's okay. Only if that happens will the order of the Provisional Government be followed by the workers and the soldiers. This is absolutely crucial in the Soviet establishing authority and basically a system of veto over what the Provisional Government is doing. So the Soviet is saying, we will support the Provisional Government, but only so far as we like what they are doing. The Soviet, of course, is able to get compliance from its representatives, troops, the soldiers and the sailors, as well as factory orders, because they have that sense of direct input into the Soviet itself. And the impact of Order Number 1 is basically constraining the power of the provisional government. It needs that tick of approval from the Soviet in order to function effectively. So we have here what is referred to as a dual authority operating. The provisional government is effectively running the government, but the Soviet has so much actual power and influence during this time that it is operating side by side with the provisional government. And that's what we call the dual authority. We've got to remember who is the Soviet representing, and the influence that they have, and the importance of these people in, what's actually happening in the country during this time. So we've got our dual authority happening. Let's try to gain an understanding of what these two bodies are actually going for. And in fact, there was a lot of overlap to begin with. In February, March 1917, there's a lot of overlap between what they are aiming for. Both of them agreed that there needs to be elections for a new constituent assembly. Okay, so democratic elections to, select a new democratic parliament. They both agreed that they needed to introduce more freedoms for the people. Things like the provisional government did do straight away. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. There was one thing, however, that was a key difference. The provisional government, as I've already said, wanted to continue a full offensive commitment to the war. The provisional government wanted to maintain its connection with its allies, Britain and France in particular. The Soviet, however, wants to only have defensive operations. That is, it will hold the Russian line. It doesn't want to lose Russian territory, but it also wants to end the war ASAP. Think about it. Who does the Soviet represent again? Soldiers. What do the soldiers want? They want to end the war. They're dying. They are exhausted. So the Soviet has a separate policy from the provisional government, and this, from the very beginning, is a key difference between the Soviet and the provisional government. Now you might ask why the Soviet was supporting these kinds of ideas, particularly this democratic election. What we've got to understand from the very beginning, the Soviet is dominated by the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries. They supported a constitutional democracy as a step towards a socialist revolution. I'll talk more about that ideology in some other lectures, but just remember here, well, we know that the Bolsheviks end up seizing power in October 1917. At this stage, the Bolsheviks are very much a minority and do not have control of the Soviet and its policy. So we've got these Soviets. So again, let's look at our Petrograd Soviet here. But what we see is that this idea is very successful. And in the next part, I'll show you how the power of the Soviets, which they've so effectively set up, actually proliferates. That is, it expands as the idea of the Soviet expands dramatically across Russia, and the power of the Soviet actually grows as the power of the provisional government declines. We'll look at that in the next part of the lecture.